and if there's maybe a lesson for us today in terms of understanding how, with similar instances of sort of state impunity, nobody's indicted or something along those lines, these, what takes place behind the scenes.
Thank you for redirecting me, because that's, yeah, no, I think that's one of the most important things I hope people get out of this book, is that when you see stories, for example, out of Chicago or Baltimore or Ferguson, and we have the video evidence, right, that somebody has just been shot by a member of law enforcement, and they didn't have a gun, they weren't resisting, and then they don't get indicted. Or if they do get indicted, which is very rare, like in Baltimore, then they don't get convicted. And I think that sends a message to the nation that, well, I guess that means there wasn't any evidence. Or I guess that means that, maybe it was justified. And the Attica cover-up that I spend so much time on shows you to never ever believe that again. Because from the moment that this happens, the state police are altering photographs, splicing film, intimidating witnesses, including the funeral directors of the hostage funeral homes, basically forcing them to sign affidavits that their hostages have had their throats slit and not been shot. Like intimidation. And that in the governor's office, they are covering for them and covering up for them. And you get to see how the grand jury process works in this book. And you get to understand that if someone gets indicted in this country from law enforcement, it's a freaking miracle. And that the level of cover-up, and this is where it falls apart, but that in this country there remain people of conscience. And sometimes they are the most surprising people, the people that you would least expect, the people that had no intention of standing up and no idea what the stakes were until they were living it. And Malcolm Bell was one of those guys. He just couldn't stomach it. And the coroner who tells about the bullet wounds, he just couldn't stomach it. And there are those, not just the Attica brothers, but the heroes and heroines in this book who stand up. And by the way, they pay a huge price. The coroner is hounded, the state troopers threaten him, they drive by his house, he ends up dying at 54 years old, he is hounded, and so people paid high prices and still stood up.
One of the things that was really shocking was to see the way those, the having known what actually took place in Attica, the way in which some of the information dribbled out and some of it still sort of remained kind of outside of the public's purview.
I think we don't know half of it even still. I mean, there's 762 pages in this book, but the truth is that this goes much deeper than even I was able to find. Let's start with the relationship between the federal government and the state government.
Sure.
I mean, I think that this is the tip of the iceberg, and that's why we're all still demanding the records be open, because I think somebody's going to write this book all over again, and hopefully it's sooner, not later, with even more information.
And on that point, have you gotten any response from state officials since in the process of preparing the book? We talked about it a little bit, but since the book has come out and it's received a good deal of publicity?
Yeah, so it's been very interesting. I just got back yesterday from New York. I've been in New York, Baltimore, and DC. And so when I was in DC, you'll be interested to know that the head of Homeland Security was at my talk. I'm hoping sympathetically. It was interesting. He had my book and he stayed the whole time. But so people are
time in the schedule to be able to make to participate, or at least attend.
He was actually there, and you can always tell the guys with the the earpieces.
Yeah.
So the state of New York has not responded to me directly, but yesterday they announced that they're going to have a public website, actually it's up, a public website to make all Attica documents available. Because clearly people are leaning on them now, including the survivors who have been leaning on them. But I went to the website, and you look at the qualifying language, and it says all publicly available Attica documents. That's not the problem. So they are going for the PR buck right now. They are trying to look like they're being responsive. As far as I know, we are not having any plans to release the Attica records. But I think I want to say stay tuned, because I have the inventory of all the records the state has. because one of the attorney generals gave it to me. And I want to do a piece with a reporter, and I want to make the inventory public. Because the inventory tells you a great deal.
So basically the table of contents of all.
Yeah, but it's pretty detailed. So it'll say people's names, and it'll say, you know, in box 30, folder 12, you know, it's a very detailed inventory. And it helped me. I mean, you know, and by the way, that's when I got shut down with freedom of information. When I requested box 30, folder 12, and the specific information on officer X, Y, or Z. But I think we're gonna just keep pushing, so we'll see.
And was it in those records that you found out information specifically about some of the troopers who were involved?
Yes.
Okay.
And you asked about getting flack. I have gotten some flack. It's come up I probably have done 40 interviews in the last couple of days, and some radio, some TV. Enormous controversy. I named the names, the law enforcement names that have been protected for 40 years. And I've taken some heat for that. But I want to say two things about it. First of all, I'm a historian, and had I not written what I knew that the state knew at the time, then I would have been part of the cover-up. So it's not my responsibility to protect people in the past. My responsibility is to tell you what happened when it happened. But here's what's interesting. In this book, I also named prisoners who the state believed did a certain act, because I'm a historian and I'm writing the history. Not one person has said to me, why did you name so-and-so? What about his family? Why would you impugn his character like that by naming him? But when it comes to law enforcement, people were a little taken aback and up in arms that I would name somebody whom the state, by the way, two of whom admitted that they had killed the people I say that they killed. And I took flack for naming their names, but never once, nobody cared that I named a prisoner who was accused of one of those 62 crimes that he was not guilty of.
Just on that point, I know the museum is going to be doing a series of events kind of on this question of rebellions, and one of the events they're looking at doing is on Imam Jamil Al-Amin, right? Al-Amin and a number of other sort of... Okay. Imam Jamil Al-Amin was formerly known as H.R.A.P. Brown, who was a key leader in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then later a number of other radical organizations across the country. And he, along with a number of political prisoners, Al-Amin was arrested a little over, I think, a decade ago, and incarcerated on what many believe to be trumped-up charges. But he and a number of other veterans of the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement have kind of put forward calls for some aspect of sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission to look into the state action, right, in response to organizing that was taking place, not just in the South, but in the North as well. And one of the things that the way in which you kind of unpack this question of a cover-up kind of raised in my mind was the degree to which there's so little that we know, at least on the state side, of actions that were taken, not just in Attica, but across the country, and how hard it is. I mean, this is kind of from my perspective as a historian, but how hard it is to get that information. A lot of the research that I did was on the Black Panther Party in Chicago and connected to the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and the same, circumstances play out in a similar way there. And just from your experience, what would the process, or what would it take to have some kind of, it doesn't even have to be on the level of South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but some sort of opening of some degree of transparency in terms of the way in which the state has operated in response to a number of these freedom struggles. And at least for supporters of Al-Amin or other political prisoners like Mutulu Shakur, what kind of obstacles would they face in terms of trying to win some degree of transparency?
I think that's first of all, this idea of truth and reconciliation, that's exactly what the Attica survivors have been demanding for the last 20 years. They literally, even, again, the hostages, they went to Albany and they said, we want to have a formal truth and reconciliation that would finally, they actually said, we don't even want prosecutions, right? We just want to know what happened. Open it up, have responsibility, have people take responsibility. And I want to say that, I think that's right on, but I'm very skeptical. I mean, here we have a book, it's 762 pages and it names names, and we still can't even get the state of New York to admit anything happened. They still deny responsibility for Attica. And so I feel like this is where historians come in. I mean, I don't want to inflate our profession too much, but we have to be the ones writing this history. I think we need a full history of surveillance in America. And I'm not talking about even post 9/11 for surveillance, we need that too. But I'm talking about how do we understand what happened to the Black Panther Party until we understand what the state was really doing? How do we understand any of the most important struggles of the 21st and 20th and 19th centuries until we understand what the lay of the land really was? And I gotta tell you, I felt that I was just, again, scratching the surface. I heard rumor that there is something there that, you know, we know about COINTELPRO, right? The FBI counterintelligence operation to destabilize groups like the Panthers and the Weather Underground. But the only reason we know that is because radicals broke into the FBI offices and found the documents. That's the only reason we know about COINTELPRO. I heard rumor that there's something, there was an undercover, there was an undercover group in the CIA and FBI run by John Mitchell, the Attorney General, called Operation Shadow Spear. And it was expressly designed to infiltrate the prisons to ward off prison rebellions. And I don't have a doubt in the world that it exists, and I don't have a doubt in the world that it played a role here. But how do we find that? And not everyone's going to be lucky enough to find that wall of documents, right? So I think
the far-off county office.
I think
the phone call.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the reason why, frankly, I don't want to miss this moment to keep pushing the state of New York with that inventory and everything else. But I share that. I don't know how we do it, but I think we've got to do it because there's a whole lot of people still in prison, and there's a whole lot of people that gave up their whole lives for greater justice in this country, and they were neutralized, and we don't even know the half of how that happened. That's part of our history, and we have a right to it. These are state institutions. They are federal institutions. We vote for these people. We pay their salaries. I mean, to put it in its most base level, we have a right to this information.
Just stepping back from the sort of history and thinking about it in the present day sense, you know, not a lot of people might spend their days thinking that much about prisons or thinking about questions of mass incarceration. If there's for the sort of the average run-of-the-mill citizen who's maybe just a little bit concerned or curious, what is it that they should get about not just the history of Attica, but about the way in which prisons operate today, or what prisons mean today, and what kind of conversation do folks need to be having in the light of this history?
So the Attica book is a history, but it ends very much today because of the lessons not learned at Attica, and actually deliberately distorted about Attica. We, as I keep saying, build a country that has more than 7 million people under correctional control, locks up people longer than it ever has, gives people more solitary confinement than it have ever been given. And the connections with Attica are explicit, but at the end of the day, that happened then, and here we are today. And what we need to know is that prisons are worse today than they were in Attica. And the conditions are worse. They're more repressive. The book ends with the story of George Williams, who just in 2011 was beaten so badly in C Block of Attica that he almost was killed. And he stands up against this story in 2011. He's in here. We have more young people in prison today than we've ever had. We have more policing than we've ever had. We have more militarized policing. I was at an event last night, the night before, I can't remember, we did a moderated discussion like this. Ta-Nehisi Coates and I were in New York doing this, and Ta-Nehisi says, you know, this seems like this was really, Attica was a militarized lynching. And, you know, it was. And then we just militarized it even more. So the punchline is that if this horrifies you, we're in a far worse position today. And I wanted this book to humanize the people behind bars, and that's why I spend time to tell you who L.D. Barkley is and who Frank Big Black Smith is, because of course, just like today, back then they were people's brothers, fathers, sisters, mothers, children, and so the message out of this book is, you know, not in your name, like you gotta speak out against prisons, and plenty of people are, and just like at Attica, formerly incarcerated folks are at the forefront of that movement today, and they insist that they be there, and that's exactly who should be leading this movement. People, Detroiters like Shaka Senghor, who some of you know, Yusuf Shakur, I mean, you know, I could just name a lot of local people who are fighting the fight here. And so I think the connections they couldn't be tighter.
Wonderful. And like we said earlier, this is very much a piece of history, but it's something that continues to live with us today. So I want to thank, on behalf of the museum, for coming. I know there's some information about a book signing that's going to be taking place.
Okay. What time is it now?
Yeah, actually, we're going to show the film.
Oh, we're going to do the film.
We have the film to show. Pardon me?
Can I tell a little bit just about the
Absolutely.
film really quickly? So you should know, I mean, some of you might feel like you need to stretch your legs, but I would love for you to see this film. This is a film done by Christine Christopher. She is a Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. She did another powerful documentary called July '64, which is about the Rochester Rebellion of '64. And she came to do this Attica story. She stood with me in that museum. She was lifting up those clothes with me. And she did this film to tell you, you're going to see people in here who we talked about. You're going to see L.D. Barkley's sister talk about how she hears about L.D.'s death. You're going to see Tom Wicker. This was filmed right before he died. You're going to see Malcolm Bell, the whistleblower. You're going to see Attica brother Melvin Marshall in one of the most difficult to watch and powerful moments in this film. And so it's 50 minutes. I really encourage you to stick around to watch Criminal Injustice at Attica.
For those who, if you decide to leave, it's very important that the book is for sale in our bookstore, $35. But again, I entreat you, I've seen this film 3 times. It's extremely riveting. I'd like you to absorb the film and join Heather in the bookstore immediately thereafter for a book signing. This book we're really trying to get to the truth at the museum in terms of our history. And certainly as this book, we start with reading, literacy, to promote independent thought, critical analysis. And I believe Heather is indicating she's, in that tradition of the scholar activist, that this type of book, that to use the United States name, radicalize individuals. Please, we have 50 copies, limited purchase, so we'd like to see them all leave the store today. The film will start momentarily, and again, if you can give our guests, scholars,